and I'm the president of the Commission Nationale des Parents Francophones. Founded in 1988, our network of 12 organizations represents parents living in minority communities who choose to make French a part of their lives and that of their children, including non-Francophone spouses of exogamous or multilingual couples. Thank you for inviting the CNPF to appear before you today to address the issue of federal funding for official language minority post-secondary institutions. I'd like to focus on the many needs and concerns parents have about their children's pursuit of post-secondary education in French. The parent is the child's primary educator and source of emotional and informational support from infancy to adulthood. One study found that the informational and emotional support provided by parents is the most significant, if not the most important, source of support for adolescents ahead of teachers and guidance counselors. So parents have a front row seat when it comes to thinking about their child's post-secondary education. Unfortunately, parents feel ill-equipped to guide their teenagers towards post-secondary education in French. Post-secondary orientation is not easy in itself. There are many options available, and it's a big step in life for both the young person and their parent. Moreover, if you want to continue in French, everything becomes even more complex. In fact, there's a lack of access and visibility for French language post-secondary institutions. Many parents have noted that it's difficult to find information on training programs and existing Francophone institutions. And sometimes a high school's promotion of French language post-secondary training is limited to the communities or the provinces and territories Francophone post-secondary institution, leaving little choice. Easy, comprehensive access to information about French language training and programs is essential. In addition, it would be desirable to offer parents better guidance from guidance counselors in our French language schools. Periodic meetings with parents and their young children would provide the necessary support to better assist their teenagers when the time comes to choose a post-secondary institution. There is no guarantee that a teenager who has developed a Francophone identity and sense of belonging within his or her family and community from an early age will pursue post-secondary education in French. In fact, everything depends on the active offer of programs in French. In Canada, there's a huge imbalance between the number of French language programs offered in post-secondary institutions and those offered in English. We need a greater number and diversity of French language programs in official language minority communities. These programs need to be distributed across the country. Currently, more than half of the programs offered in French in minority contexts are offered by the University of Ottawa. According to one study, although the French-speaking population of the Western provinces represents 19.8% of the population of French-speaking communities in the minority setting, the programs offered in French represent only 7.9%. According to the same study, 27.5% of those who studied in French migrated to another province compared to 10.3% of those who studied only in English. Leaving one's community to pursue an education in French is a reality for many Francophones. Very often, those who leave their communities never return. This exodus has a major impact on the vitality and sustainability of official language minority communities. Not to mention the fact that moving out of one's community is expensive. In this respect, there's evidence that studying in French at the post-secondary level in a minority context generates higher costs and greater debt for students. According to one study, those who studied in French at university have a higher average debt than those who studied in English. Added to this are the mobility costs incurred by having to travel outside one's community. Greater availability of bursaries, scholarships for Francophones pursuing post-secondary studies in French, as well as mobility grants for those forced into moving out of their province would encourage the choice of studying in French at the post-secondary level. So, to conclude, there's an urgent need for concrete action to better equip parents to guide their teenagers towards post-secondary education in French. More French language programs must also be offered so that students can choose the program of study they're passionate about without having to leave their communities. And finally, for greater equity, we need more scholarship programs to reduce debt for young Francophones who choose to pursue their post-secondary education in French. Thank you once again for the time and for your attention, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you, Ms. Anderson. everyone who is with us virtually today, I just want to confirm that the sound tests have been done. Now, for the next 5 minutes, Mr. Theriault, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everyone. As the president of the French-Canadian Youth Federation, the FJCF, I'm very pleased to be here today to present our position on federal funding for official language minority post-secondary institutions. I would like to point out that the land on which I'm standing is part of the unceded traditional territory of the Mi'kmaqs. The FJCF is a national organization run by and for French-speaking youth in Canada. Our members are youth organizations based in 9 provinces and 3 territories, and they represent the interests of French-speaking youth aged 14 to 25. Our expertise is the lived experience of young people, and it is with this in mind that we present our observations today. As you no doubt know, choosing a post-secondary institution can be complex. For a young Northern Brunswicker like me, my options for post-secondary education in French were limited. I could choose to stay at home and access a very limited offering at a satellite campus, move to an urban center in my province, or go study in Quebec. My case is certainly not unique, and too often young people in our communities are forced to travel long distances or relocate if they wish to pursue their studies in French in the field of their choice, and this comes at a significant cost. Even so, I'm speaking to you from a position of privilege, and I recognize that. In fact, I'm lucky. I have friends who have had to move from province to province in order to pursue their post-secondary education in French. For some, because the costs associated with moving away from home are far too high, they're stuck with a virtual program or nothing at all. Let's be honest. Post-secondary education behind a screen isn't easy, and many end up giving up. For others, language insecurity, limited program offerings, or simply a lack of knowledge about French language institutions means they will simply choose an English language institution. In addition to program choices, young people are also concerned about the services they can access on their campus. Mental health services, student success support services, and accommodation services are essential to ensuring greater success and reducing the dropout rate. Unfortunately, these services are sometimes too little available or unknown in our institutions. Recognizing the access challenges for young people wishing to pursue their post-secondary education in French, the Government of Canada created a scholarship program for young people with French as a second language in 2018. It's a proven program. However, I can assure you that the challenges faced by young people with French as a second language when it comes to post-secondary studies in French apply equally to young people with French as their first language. It therefore makes no sense that this program is not available to the thousands of young people who are proud students in one of the 760 French language schools outside Quebec. The need for Francophone community spaces on campuses could also help this transition and build bridges between the community, institutions, and students. These spaces would help foster a sense of belonging among French-speaking youth and forge important links between young people. Student life is a major factor when it comes to choosing a post-secondary institution, and the network of friends we create there contributes to the success of our studies and the retention of young people in our institutions and communities. Mobility among young people is, for many, a need and even a necessity for the success of their studies, while at the same time allowing them to enjoy a variety of educational experiences, enabling them to learn about all our French-speaking communities from one end of the country to the other. What if our institutions had the resources to work together to ensure student mobility? Knowledge development, identity building, and commitment are essential to the development and, above all, the sustainability of our Francophone minority communities. There is no doubt that post-secondary institutions in our communities play an essential role in community development. Whether it's a question of infrastructure, improving the offer of modern and coveted programs, working together, offering specialized services to students, or developing student life on campus, these institutions require strong and sustained support. Building the capacity of our French language post-secondary institutions is a strategic investment by the federal government in our communities. Thank you for listening, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Nos 2 témoins sont dans le temps. Eux sont disciplinés. J'espère que nos membres en seront autant.
So we'll get started with the first round of questions. We'll start with the Conservative Party, the first Vice Chair of the Standing Committee on Official Languages. Mr. Godin, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we'll try to lead by example and be disciplined. Well, thank you, Ms. Anderson, Mr. Racine, and Mr. Thériault for being with us this morning, and allow me to comment on how energetic and enthusiastic Mr. Thériault is, and it's very good to see a young person that is really engaged to this level in the issue that's before us. Ms. Anderson, you referred in your opening remarks to an urgent need to help parents, accompany parents. What would be the first concrete action that we as lawmakers can take so that we do this efficiently? Well, I have young children, 19, 17, and 15-year-olds. In our schools, there aren't enough services for them. So it's always up to me to do the research, all of the work, even though we are well connected in a Francophone community. So I really want to be able to help them out the best I can. But you have English schools on the other side of the same street where they are a lot better prepared. They have already made their picks, etc. So that becomes an issue for us. Do they go to the same school? They go to these are different schools. French school on one side, English school on the other side of the same street, and their approach is completely different. What province is this? This is in Alberta. So what you're telling me is that in Alberta, in a Francophone school, there is no orientation counselor. Well, there is one, and she's serving 5 different schools, actually. So this puts at risk the future orientation of young people wishing to study in French. Yes, exactly. So that needs to be increased in order to better orient the young people. Of course, parents can help do this, but when you have someone external, that's different. Well, planifying one's post-secondary studies, what courses, etc., because if this prep work isn't done, sometimes they're not accepted into post-secondary institutions. Now, is this my responsibility? Is this the school's responsibility? And there is really not enough communication. So you're recommending a solution through a guidance counselor, but it comes all boils down to the resources. Yes, financing and funding for our schools. Do you have access to comprehensive post-secondary programs in French in your province? So a young person who wishes to continue their studies in French in Alberta, do they have a choice of programs that they can pick from? Can they go from the start all the way to the master's level, post-secondary level? Yes, but there is very little choice. So there is need for added funding on that front as well. Thank you very much.
Mr. Thériault, in your introductory message, you said that there was a bursary program that has been put in place for a few years now. There's a clientele that has access to it, but the other clientele doesn't. Can you please explain that situation? Yes, thank you for that question. In fact, right now, bursaries are available for students who study French as a second language from immersion programs, but that scholarship or bursary program is not available for students who study in French language schools, whose first language is French, and that's what we're asking for. A scholarship program that would allow young Francophones studying in French to have access to scholarships so that they continue their studies at the post-secondary level in a French language post-secondary institution. So you're saying that young people in immersion have access to this program, but Francophones who want to continue their studies, and we don't want to lose them in the system and going to English schools, they don't have access to that government program. What year was that included? That was included in the official language plan into 2018-2022. We're asking for a new program, new scholarship program that would allow young Francophones to continue their studies in French at the post-secondary level. It's not in the action plan for 2023 to 2028, to your knowledge. Exactly. So if we had a choice, Mr. Theriault, you talked about including or increasing scholarships or giving access to them, but you also mentioned, if I recollect properly, the programs are not necessarily accessible or are not very numerous. So there's an exodus of young people from their French language birth community or their birth province, and that increases costs for them. We are legislators. We're there to try to find the most effective means to do things. Money doesn't grow on trees, as you know, so if we had a choice, are we better off investing in scholarships for our young people or investing in the institutions to make sure that post-secondary education is more accessible and gives you more variety? That's a very good question, Mr. Godin, but you've gone beyond your 6 minutes. So next 6 minutes from the Liberals. Mr. Sanson. Go ahead, Mr. Sanson. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my colleagues and the witnesses, Mr. Theriault. The CNPF was always close to my heart, so I'm very pleased to see you here. I know you're talking about the importance of post-secondary education, but I'm very concerned with early childhood. And I know that's one of your key objectives, and you've played a role in this for a long time now, for that success toward French language schools. So, quickly, how would the amendments to C-35 help your association? Well, it'll certainly help the students in our schools. That encourages parents to register them, enroll them in those programs. There's more choice, more funding for early childhood, places that didn't exist in the past. That's a major issue for the community. Do you think that if a child whose parents don't have access, will they choose a French or English school? English, certainly. English only. So do you believe there are spaces missing? Do you think it'll lead to assimilation? Certainly. 100% agreed. So let's recognize that C-35 is better. The 2024 budget talks about early childhood. Can you tell us a little more about that? How will that help you? It'll certainly help because it'll create more spaces for parents looking for daycare spaces or pre-kindergarten. That's the beginning of the continuum. You're always talking about pyramids. That's the foundation. You have to have a solid foundation in order to continue to the top. And now we're working on that continuum. I had the experience as Director General. We doubled our student population within 10 years by having a 4-year program because the parents weren't sure if they wanted to put their kids in French school. They said, we are exogamous families, our children don't speak French well enough. But by having that 4-year program, well, all of a sudden, they built relationships with the schools and they put their children there. Do you see that throughout the country? Yes, and we have testimony from parents who are both Francophone and who have to put their children in Anglophone daycare centers. And we've seen very concrete cases in Nova Scotia, in Alberta. They decide to place their children in English schools because they're scared that their children will not be comfortable enough in French to succeed. So that's a problem. We have to find a solution. And if this is a way to solve this, it's thanks to your hard work that we can push this agenda forward. That's very important. Mr. Theriault, I didn't forget you. You come from New Brunswick, correct? Yes. That's great. That's right next door to my province. I'm from Nova Scotia. We've cooperated a great deal between our two provinces. So, one question. Today, in my opinion, you mentioned there are 750 French schools across Canada. That's good. You're up to date in your information. That's quite impressive. But when I went to school, there were no French schools. Today, children have access to French schools across Canada. There's many more students in French schools. Why don't we see an increase in post-secondary education in French? Well, that's a very good question. That's the problem. You're asking questions about early childhood. Well, it's important to get children in the early years. If they go to a French school, they'll continue in French. It's important to keep them in those institutions to make sure they do their post-secondary education in French. Because if we lose them somewhere in the formal education continuum, that's a lost opportunity. And many young people decide to go in English because they're linguistically insecure. That's a very important phenomenon among young people. The programs just aren't available in French often. The post-secondary education opportunities may be further away. There are many reasons why young people decide to choose an Anglophone institution rather than a Francophone one. But, Mr. Thériault, we could write a whole book on this, and I've experienced this, and your experience too. So I'd like to pick up on the suggestion you made to my colleague earlier, that is scholarships to encourage students to go to French language institutions, because it's true. In Nova Scotia, those who want to study in French, who are from Cape Breton or Belle Madame, they have to drive 7 hours to go to a French university, but they have a big choice of Anglophone ones, so it's discouraging. I had to go study in New Brunswick. I had to drive 7 hours or 4 hours to New Brunswick. So talk to me about that. Have young people talked about that with ministers? Have you had discussions? Is this a topic that we have to push further? Well, give him a second to answer at least. No, I'm sorry. I'm fair with everybody. We'll have an opportunity. Mr. Sanson has said something right. Witnesses should have an opportunity to answer quickly. We have two rounds of questions. Mr. Vice Chairman, we have 6 minutes for Mr. Beaulieu of the Bloc Québécois. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our witnesses for being here today. The National Association of Francophone Parents had conducted a study a long time ago asking where did the billions go, that determined at some crucial point that in all provinces the teaching of French was prohibited for many generations. The bulk of this funding went to Anglophones in Quebec, 47% of it. Do you think that there's been a big change? What were the consequences of that? Because assimilation was in full swing at the time. So what were the consequences of that? And is this continuing? Has there been a major sea change? Well, whether there's been a change, I couldn't say really, because essentially it's very difficult to determine how provinces are spending education funds. So tracing that funding is very difficult. At some point, a few years ago, we signed an agreement with Canadian Heritage. It was called Strategic Funds, to have some transparency within the departments, ministries of education within each province to determine how the money was spent. To date, it remains very difficult to find out. But I think there are various studies before the committee here have demonstrated that there was some diversion of funds, shall we say. But I dare hope that by pointing out those situations, they will not happen as much anymore. But the National Association of School Boards could give you more information about that. But a great deal of work remains to be done. Okay. That's a question for both of you. I saw a study that showed that the funding of university education in French outside Quebec was lower than the proportion of Francophones outside Quebec. Do you think it should be increased? Should the funding of university education outside Quebec, does it have a major importance? Yes, absolutely. There are not enough institutions, there are not enough programs within the existing ones. So any money that could be spent on these institutions to have more of them and more spaces, more programs, would be a good thing. Same answer, really. We see the problems that are incredibly acute in our minority communities. There are fewer programs available than in Anglophone institutions. There's a very little choice. We have to go further, travel further. That incurs additional costs, less attractive student life as in Anglophone institutions. So these institutions have to be adequately funded in order to address these terrible problems. When we look at the current state of the situation, which seems to be quite critical, we're talking about chronic underfunding of Francophone universities. Shouldn't there be a better balance struck? Because a good part of the funding was given to Anglophone institutions in Quebec. The situation is more or less still the same because the funding of Anglophone institutions by the Quebec government is twice as high as the demographic weight of Anglophones. Their Canadian research funds, 30 to 40% goes to Anglophone institutions in Quebec, whereas when it comes to Francophone institutions outside Quebec, there's really chronic underfunding. Shouldn't this be balanced better? Definitely. I think there has to be a better balance struck. And one important piece of information, about 63% of our young people come from mixed marriages. I talked to a father who said, with my wife, it goes very well. But when time came to talk about the children's education, it was a major fight in our family. It's always a dilemma. The Anglophone parent says, well, we should go to Anglophone universities. It'll cost us less. It's closer to home. And the Francophone parent has to say, well, no, it's important to continue education in French. So it tears up these families. Why? Because there's not enough choice of programs for young people. And another comment, many young people told me if they went to French language post-secondary education, it's not because of the Francophone parent, it's because of the Anglophone parent. So the more the Anglophone parent is open to French language education, the more that student is encouraged to go to French university. I was absolutely stunned by that. Many young people told me that. Inaudible. 20 seconds, Mario. Those who say that it's not a zero-sum game, that money that goes to French language universities or English ones does not harm the people who will go to the French or English side. What do you think? 5 seconds. There's a crying need. Yes. Thank you. Dear colleagues, you all have an iPhone with a clock. So we're going to maximize the rounds, so please respect the limits. Mr. Beaulieu, I'm not pointing at you particularly.
Mais là, on se dirige.
Now, we're going towards Alberta, not quite, but we're going to Manitoba with Ms. Ashton for the next 6 minutes from the NDP. Thank you. You cut the trip shorter. You stop in the middle. I'd like to welcome our witnesses today. Thank you for your testimony today. I'm going to ask my questions to Ms. Anderson. You shared experiences that are very similar to the experiences of families here in Manitoba. And during the study, with almost all of our witnesses, we talked about one thing, the impact of the labor shortage on education, the fact that we don't have enough teachers or other teaching professionals at different levels, educators in general. Could you talk to us a little bit about the situation in Alberta? What's the situation when it comes to this labor shortage in your province, and what's the impact on French language education? Well, in our region, regardless of the language, English or French, we have a shortage of teachers. We are here to talk about French in the minority setting. That is clear. But we need a strategy to encourage young people to pursue a career in education. Nothing is encouraging them as we speak because it's not recognized as a key area. And I have 3 children. One of them only is looking to take up teaching as a profession, but they're not really encouraged in general. So we need to find a new approach to deal with the situation. Some parents are engaged in this. That's great, but there's a challenge, and for parents like myself, maybe more is needed. Would you say that this labor shortage has an impact on how stable the education is? To avoid burnout for teachers, but also to create a more stable environment and a feeling of being a team. Maybe does it help create that? And do you think those might be some potential areas through which we can address the issue of labor shortage, and can it be done by the federal government? Well, definitely. Any incentive to keep teaching professionals in the profession will contribute a great deal because there are teachers who are leaving, and there's a lot of that's because sometimes there's a lot of competition between school boards. English schools are competing with French schools, and it's almost always the case to go to an English school and having more choices and more options and climbing up the ladder, professionally speaking, compared to staying in French schools. If you have the community, then that's great. If language has a special place in your heart, that's great. But given the financial situation of our country, money has a lot of importance. And a lot of the time, teaching professionals leave for English schools. Okay, last question on this. We heard from many post-secondary institutions during the study. They've all told us that they need stable, sufficient funding and that it's essential to the work they're doing. As a parent and as someone who plays a role in your organization, what's your take on this, on the funding for Francophone institutions, and would it help also deal with the labor shortage issue? The more money we have in our French language institutions, the better it will be for the youth. When I ask students if they know about Francophone post-secondary institutions outside Quebec, they cannot even tell me the names of 2. So just having money to promote the existing programs and adding new programs and making them more attractive would be a great help. They will have better chances of continuing their education in French, and it is really, really sad when this is not possible. And I have one of my children who wants to continue in French, but there are no options for him. Thank you for sharing this with us, and I think it affects all of us. Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson. Mr. Thériault, thank you for your testimony. I know that your organization does essential work to face the challenges before young Francophones. You offered many programs in the past, very important programs, and there is a Francophone government internship program you had in the past, and I was very concerned when I heard that this program no longer exists. So how can we encourage young people to live and work in French, and the lack of Francophone government internships, how does it impact their professional integration and the vitality of Francophone communities in the country? Excellent question, Ms. Ashton. All of our members are unfortunately not showing the necessary level of discipline today. We're at 6 minutes and 5 seconds, but Mr. Thériault, you will have later on the chance to answer the question. But we're now starting a second round. Please, let's really stick to the time this time around. So next round, 5 minutes, Mr. Dalton. Mr. Thériault, Ms. Anderson, thank you very much for your contributions. It's important for us to hear your voices, because if we don't, and if we don't learn about your challenges, then we cannot find solutions. Ms. Anderson, can you talk to us a little bit about your organization, the National Francophone Parents Commission, and the work you're doing in Alberta? I'm from British Columbia, but can you talk to us a bit more about your organization? Well, our organization exists in all of the territories and provinces in Canada. We have representatives everywhere, and these representatives represent parents in these regions. We also have a branch in BC, and they have a council over there, and they are able to learn about the experiences of parents and students. The only province from which we don't have a representative at the table would be Quebec, because we're more focused on French minority settings. I've been online, and I was able to find out that there are 4 Francophone school boards in Alberta. So how is your relationship with them? How does it work, rather, with them when it comes to their funding? Are they being subsidized by the province? How does it function? For the specifics, well, I don't really know about the exact breakdown of federal and provincial funding, but in general, it functions in a similar way to the English school boards. Well, I'm not a teaching professional myself, but I find this discouraging and surprising. Are you referring to the French school boards or public schools where you have other programs? Well, I'm talking about French schools in our region. There is an orientation once a week, and 5 schools in the school board, and the counselor spends a day in each of these schools. This is provincially financed, and it's the school boards who are responsible to identify the needs, and they come up with the funds. But this is a bit of a challenge. We are faced with many challenges in Alberta. In BC, again, in the minority setting, there is not enough funding to cover all the needs. Well, in British Columbia, there are special subsidies based on the number of students with specific needs. So it functions in the same way. but the French programs are expected to do twice the work with the same money. You also represent parents and families. Can you talk to us a bit about the frustrations of Francophone and Francophile communities about sending their children to French programs? Do they really attach a lot of importance to making sure that the children are raised in a Francophone environment? Can you talk to us about their challenges? Well, I'm one such parent. My husband is Anglophone. He doesn't speak a word of French. He's been slowly learning French because we've been together for more than 20 years now. But anything that has to do with the French language setting, it's my responsibility. So when you have a life partner next to you, and then the education and the culture of your children, balancing the two is not always very easy. Okay, I have 2 minutes. All right. Mr. Theriault, the variety of the program offering is based on the number of students. Money follows students, but the problem is that sometimes you don't have a sufficient number of students, and so not enough programs. So it's a chicken and egg situation. Do you have solutions? Is my question. Well, scholarships might be a solution, but financing sufficiently our institutions is another solution. Apologies, I have excellent members of this committee, but they're not very disciplined with the time today. So next speaker for 5 minutes will be Mr. Angelo Iacono. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, dear colleagues, dear witnesses. Thank you for being with us this morning. I'd like to start with you, Ms. Anderson. How much federal funding do you receive every year for research in French? That's a good question. I'll turn to my colleague. You mean to the Commission nationale des parents francophones? How much money do we receive for research? Well, for research, we don't receive anything right now. We receive funding for programming, so to support our member associations in offering services and supporting parents, but we don't have a separate research budget. So then what would be your level of need if you were to put a number to it for research? Well, we would need to look into it. We got the census data for 2021 on right holders. So we have that information now, but we also need to know how this will change over time, because we have more and more Francophone immigrants, more and more right holders, but we now need to do research to understand the exact type of infrastructure we need at the primary and secondary and post-secondary levels to be able to meet the demand. Are you aware of provincial funding that's available to you? It varies a lot from province to province. It varies a great deal. In British Columbia, there is some money that goes to the Parents Association from the province. In Alberta, it's next to nothing. So it varies a lot.
Has anything been done to solicit the provinces and continually? Mr. Theriault, on your side, do you know how much federal funding is for research in French? For our organization, we don't get any funding to conduct research specifically. We're a community organization, but for institutions, I wouldn't know. I'm sorry. Okay? Can you tell us what's the profile of students who go to your institutions? Are they from the region itself? Do you attract Francophones from across the country? What's the demographics? Well, our organization is based in 9 provinces and 3 territories, so we have people from all over, from Francophone schools, from immersion schools. So we do have immigrants as well, so we have quite a varied pool of young people taking part in our activities and who are members. So we do have the pulse of a broad demographic group. Ms. Anderson, earlier you said the demographic profile of students. I'd like to ask the same question. Yes, but parents need a wide variety come up from various countries, backgrounds, various occupation groups. It's very diverse in our case. Earlier, Ms. Anderson, you said that you had come up with a list of your needs, and you said there's not enough money. What amount of money would be sufficient so that you could get going? We don't have a figure, so it's a bit difficult to figure out your needs and put a dollar amount to that. How could we look at this? Well, that's a question for post-secondary institutions. How much do they need to really improve programs, offer more of them, have rewards for those who continue their studies in French? I'd like to see more investment. I'm not on school boards. I don't know what it costs to come up with a guidance counselor full-time in each school, or even part-time. That would be ideal. That would be a major change compared to what we have now. But I am not a school board administrator. So what are some of the other needs you have? Because indeed, if we want to see progress, we have to better understand the needs. How much would that need cost? Those are two aspects that are very important when you solicit all levels of government. You have to know what it is and how much it costs. Could you give us some orientation on this committee? Give us some guidance? Could we get more guidance about the figure, the amount that you need? Excellent question, Mr. Iacono. We'll come back to that. For now, we're going to come to another question from Mr. Beaulieu, 2.5 minutes. It's my last question. I didn't have time to get your answer. Those who say that if we finance the Francophone university system or less, it doesn't really have an impact on the survival of French because it's not a zero-sum game. What do you think? More you finance these programs, the more that young people will be attracted to them. I'd say there's not enough choice to encourage them to continue in French. If you want to become a teacher, a nurse, or go out east to become an engineer, a lawyer, there's no choice in Western Canada. If you want to study in French, they have to study in English. I'd add that we have many parents who decide to put their children in English high school in preparation for the post-secondary level, which they think will happen in English. So we lose a lot of young people at the high school level because of the lack of supply at the post-secondary level. That's another important issue. Mr. Thériault? Well, that's a reality that we're facing. There are students who leave high school in a French school or even an immersion school who don't have access to a French language program at the post-secondary level. They end up losing their French. We see that. That's a reality we see often in New Brunswick. There's people who come out of an immersion school, who go to university in English, and end up losing their use of French. If you can keep people in post-secondary education in French, they use French, they continue that in that institution, they have more of a chance of staying and contributing to the vitality of our communities. So you agree that having a higher proportion of funding for Francophone universities is important. This is not a zero-sum game. No, of course not. It's very important. They have to be funded far more. Inaudible. What's very interesting is the scholarships for those who want to study in French. I thank you for that comment. I won't have time to get an answer, but I think it's important that that be in our document. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Ms. Ashton, 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you very much. My question is for Mr. Thériault about the issue I raised, the program about government internships. What does that mean? Those opportunities no longer exist. Should we reinvest in that kind of federal program? Well, of course, employability is a very important issue. It has a great impact. Given the cost of living that keeps going up, it's very important for young people to have access to jobs in French in our communities. We see that there are many jobs that are available, but they're not known often. They're not put forward. So internship program or creating new jobs for young people to help with the cost of education that keeps climbing, that has a great impact. Some students drop out because it's unsustainable for them to continue their studies. Do you see a program like that as being part of the vision we need to pursue by supporting French language post-secondary education, by investing in opportunity to help people live and work in French? Yes, these are programs that are very important, and that's part of the post-secondary environment. There are students who can't afford to just study. They have to have jobs. There have to be jobs available in French. We're thinking of new arrivals who come to our education, international students. They can't work in English. They don't speak English very well. It's very difficult for them to work in an Anglophone majority community. So there has to be French-oriented jobs to allow those students to have opportunities to work in French. And quite quickly, 5 seconds, Ms. Ashton. Okay, very quickly. The question of stable funding, predictable funding for post-secondary education. So yes, we support the recommendation for $80 million a year for post-secondary education. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Ashton. Before we go to the next witnesses, Ms. Anderson, in your introduction, you said that half the curriculum, I'm not sure I understood, half of it came from the University of Ottawa? Yes. In Alberta? Overall, half the programs available in French come from the University of Ottawa, according to the studies. For all Francophone and colleges outside Quebec? Yes, okay. Mr. Thériault, where do you come in northern New Brunswick? Grand Sault. That's not far from my home. Well, look, I had this unfortunate task to discipline everyone. People who are passionate about language, they want their time. I had to cut short some questions and answers, so this is fascinating. Please write to us. Anything you didn't have time to communicate to us, any additional information. Don't have a doctoral thesis on what Daryl Sanson asked you, but Daryl's comment was true. You can't dissociate post-secondary education from early childhood. Why is it that after so many years, where we had more and more French schools outside Quebec, post-secondary education is still difficult? They have trouble filling their seats in those universities. Francophones aren't applying. So I'm not asking you to do a thesis here. You can't answer that in 5 minutes, of course, but thank you very much for your participation. Please send any information to the clerk, If you'd like to share it with us, she will share it with all members of the committee. That will be part of our analysis to come up with our report. Thank you once again. We'll suspend temporarily to welcome our next witnesses.
We'll resume our dear witnesses for the second hour. We have Ms. Bouffard, who is the rector of the Saint Boniface University. I think it's your first time appearing before the Official Languages Committee. Second time? Okay, it's your second time. And
acronym is QUESCREN, right? QUESCREN. First time, I think, and we're glad to have you here at the at this committee. First time, we're glad to have you here. So how it works? Okay, the first round of question will be interactive. Question and answers, 6 minutes for each political parties. Okay. J'essaye de parler anglais. Mais
I'm just trying to speak English. Okay, that's how it's going to work. But before that, we are allowing our witnesses to do their opening remarks in 5 minutes maximum, and I'll be very strict because this way we will be able to get 2 rounds